Level 1. The blockade. Starving them into submission. Surrounded by walls, cut off from the world. The simplest and oldest form of siege warfare required no machines, no battering rams, no engineers. It required only patience and cruelty. In the ancient world, before the first catapult was ever constructed, the most common method of taking a fortified city was simply to surround it and wait. The attacker would encircle the settlement, cutting every road, blocking every river crossing, and positioning soldiers at every gate. Nothing went in, nothing came out. Time became the weapon. The Greeks understood this method intimately. During the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BC, Sparta laid siege to Athens not by storming its famous long walls, but by devastating the surrounding countryside year after year. Athenian farmland was burned, olive groves destroyed, and grain supplies severed. The walls of Athens, designed by Pericles to connect the city to its port at Piraeus, were considered invulnerable to direct assault in this era of Greek warfare. So the Spartans chose starvation. Athens held out for years, sustained by its naval supply lines through the port. But when its fleet was finally destroyed at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC, the city was cut off completely. Within months, the starving population surrendered. The walls that had protected them for decades were torn down to the sound of flute music, as Spartan soldiers celebrated the fall of their greatest rival. The Romans elevated the blockade into an engineering masterpiece. At the siege of Alesia in 52 BC, Julius Caesar faced the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, who had withdrawn his army of approximately 80,000 warriors inside the hilltop fortress. Rather than assault the heavily defended position, Caesar ordered the construction of a circumvallation, a continuous wall of fortifications encircling the entire settlement. His legions built 18 kilometers of walls, complete with towers every 25 meters, trenches filled with sharpened stakes, and concealed pits designed to impale anyone attempting to break out. Then, learning that a massive Gallic relief army was approaching, Caesar ordered a second ring of fortifications facing outward, the contravallation, stretching another 21 kilometers. His army was now sandwiched between two hostile forces, protected only by their own engineering. When the relief army of an estimated 250,000 warriors arrived and attacked from the outside, while Vercingetorix launched sorties from within, the Roman fortifications held. The Gauls were crushed between the two walls. Vercingetorix surrendered. The blockade had won what no frontal assault could have achieved. Level 2. The battering ram. Breaking through by brute force. When patience ran thin, the ancients turned to raw power. The battering ram was among the earliest purpose-built siege weapons in human history. At its most basic, it was nothing more than a heavy log carried by a group of soldiers who ran it headfirst into a gate or wall. But in the hands of the Assyrian Empire, this crude instrument was transformed into a devastating war machine that could crack open the strongest fortifications in the ancient Near East. The Assyrians were the undisputed masters of siege warfare in the ancient world. From the 9th to the 7th centuries BC, their empire stretched from Iran to Egypt, and they accomplished this through military technologies that could penetrate any fortified city. King Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BC, deployed battering rams that were approximately 5 meters long, suspended from ropes inside a protective housing with a roof and turret. Archers positioned in the turret, roughly 3 meters above the roof, provided covering fire while the ram swung freely below, its business end covered by a metal blade designed to pry apart mud brick walls. The siege of Lachish in 701 BC demonstrated the full terrifying capability of Assyrian siegecraft. King Sennacherib brought his army against this Judean hilltop city, the second most important settlement in the kingdom of Judah. The Assyrians constructed a massive siege ramp from approximately 3 million stones, each weighing about 6.5 kilograms. Laborers, likely prisoners of war and forced local workers, formed human chains, passing stones hand to hand, working around the clock in shifts. Archaeologists have calculated that roughly 160,000 stones were moved each day. Within approximately 25 days, the ramp reached the city walls. Sennacherib deployed prefabricated battering rams, hauled up the completed ramp. These machines weighed up to a ton each. The ram, a heavy wooden beam with a metal tip, was suspended inside the siege engine on metal chains. An iron chain was actually found at the top of the ramp during archaeological excavations. The defenders threw burning torches down to ignite the machines. Archers on both sides exchanged volleys. Sappers tunneled simultaneously beneath the walls. The city fell. Sennacherib was so proud of the conquest that he commissioned enormous stone relief carvings depicting every stage of the siege, which were installed in his palace at Nineveh. Those reliefs survive today in the British Museum, offering the most detailed visual record of ancient siege warfare ever discovered. Level 3. The Siege Tower. Going over the top. If you couldn't go through the wall, you went over it. The siege tower was the ancient world's answer to the problem of height. Defenders held every advantage from their elevated positions atop city walls. They could rain arrows, stones, and boiling liquids on anyone who approached. The siege tower neutralized this advantage by bringing attackers to the same height as the defenders, or even higher, turning the wall itself into a vulnerability rather than a strength. The most extraordinary siege tower ever built was the Helepolis, Greek for taker of cities, constructed for Demetrius I of Macedon during the siege of Rhodes in 305 BC. Designed by Epimachus of Athens and based on earlier work by the engineer Polyidus of Thessaly, this machine was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. According to descriptions left by Diodorus Siculus, Vitruvius, and Plutarch, the Helepolis was a tapering tower approximately 40 meters tall and 20 meters wide at its base. It contained 9 stories, connected by 2 broad staircases, one for ascending, one for descending, allowing continuous movement of soldiers and ammunition without congestion. The entire structure weighed approximately 160 tons and rested on 8 wheels, each nearly 5 meters in diameter. The machine bristled with weaponry. Heavy catapults capable of hurling 80-kilogram stones occupied the lower floors. Lighter artillery and dart throwers were positioned on the upper levels. The forward wall was perforated with artillery ports protected by mechanically adjustable shutters, lined with skins stuffed with wool and seaweed to absorb impacts and resist fire. The 3 exposed sides were clad in iron plates, making the tower effectively fireproof and arrow-proof. Moving this behemoth required 3,400 men working in relays, some pushing from inside the structure, others from behind, while a large capstan drove the wheels through a belt system. But the Rhodians proved resourceful. According to Vitruvius, the city's architect Diognetus devised a brilliantly simple countermeasure. Under cover of darkness, the Rhodians knocked a hole through their own city wall and channeled massive amounts of water, mud, and sewage onto the ground where the Helepolis was expected to advance the following day. When the colossal tower was pushed forward, it sank irretrievably into the mire. Demetrius was forced to withdraw the machine, and the siege ultimately failed. The aftermath produced an ironic legacy. The Rhodians melted down the iron plating from the abandoned Helepolis and other siege equipment, using the materials and money from selling the remaining engines to construct the Colossus of Rhodes, a massive statue of the sun god Helios that became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A weapon of destruction became the raw material for one of history's greatest monuments. Level 4. Undermining. The war beneath your feet. While battering rams pounded walls and siege towers loomed above them, a quieter, more insidious form of attack was taking place underground. Mining, or sapping, was the art of digging tunnels beneath enemy fortifications, collapsing foundations, and bringing walls crashing down from below. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work that could kill the attackers as easily as the defenders, and it represented one of the most feared tactics in all of ancient siege warfare. The technique was devastatingly simple in concept. Sappers would begin their tunnel outside the range of the defenders' weapons and dig toward the base of the city wall. Once they reached the foundations, they would excavate a large cavity directly beneath the wall, supporting the space above with wooden beams and props. When the chamber was large enough, the wooden supports were packed with combustible materials and set ablaze. As the timber burned away, the unsupported earth above would collapse, and the section of wall standing on it would crash downward into the void. The breach was then stormed by waiting troops. The Assyrians employed sappers as a standard component of their siege operations, running tunneling operations simultaneously alongside their ramp construction and ram deployment. The danger of sapping was extreme. If the tunnel was dug too deep, the wall would not collapse because the earth between the tunnel ceiling and the wall's foundation was thick enough to bear the weight. If the tunnel was too shallow, the weight of the wall above could crush the support beams prematurely, burying the sappers alive beneath tons of stone and earth. Defenders developed equally ingenious countermeasures. The most common was the countermine, a tunnel dug from inside the city to intercept the attacking tunnel. When the two tunnels met, savage underground combat would erupt in near-total darkness. In ancient China, defenders used an even more creative approach. The followers of the philosopher Mozi, known as the Mohists, were renowned for their defensive innovations during the 5th century BC. When enemies attempted to tunnel under walls, the Mohists used large bellows, the same type used for blast furnaces in iron smelting, to pump smoke and toxic fumes into the enemy tunnels, suffocating the sappers before they could complete their work. The underground war was as brutal and sophisticated as anything happening on the surface. Level 5. Artillery. Death from a distance. The invention of siege artillery changed everything. For the first time, an attacking army could strike at city walls from hundreds of meters away, beyond the reach of the defenders' arrows and stones. The catapult, in its various forms, was the ancient world's equivalent of heavy artillery, and its development transformed siege warfare from a contest of endurance and engineering into something far more destructive. The Greeks pioneered torsion-powered artillery in the 4th century BC. These machines used twisted bundles of animal sinew or hair to store enormous mechanical energy, which was released to hurl stones or heavy bolts with devastating force. Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great employed engineers who built catapults and ballistae, tension and torsion-driven engines of destruction. Alexander carried these weapons on his campaigns across the Persian Empire, deploying them against fortified cities from Tyre to the gates of India. The Romans inherited and improved Greek artillery technology with characteristic thoroughness. They replaced horsehair with animal sinew to increase strength and torsion, substituted metal components for wooden ones to improve durability, and covered springs in metal cases to protect them from the elements. Roman legions carried standardized siege artillery as part of their regular equipment. The smaller catapults were called scorpiones, capable of firing iron bolts with enough velocity to pierce multiple men. The larger stone throwers were called ballistae, and the massive single-armed catapults known as onagers, named for the wild donkey because of the violent kick they produced when fired. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the historian Josephus claimed that Roman catapults could hurl 25-kilogram stones to distances of over 360 meters. White limestone projectiles were used specifically because they were harder for defenders to spot against the sky. When the defenders learned to post lookouts who shouted warnings when they saw the white stones incoming, the Romans reportedly blackened the stones to make them invisible again. Every innovation met a counter-innovation. Every defense inspired a new form of attack. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The sound of a heavy stone striking a wall, the sight of battlements crumbling under sustained bombardment, the knowledge that nowhere behind the walls was truly safe, all of it eroded the defenders' will to resist. Many cities surrendered not because their walls had been breached, but because the sustained artillery bombardment made continued resistance feel hopeless. Level 6. Deception and Psychological Warfare. Breaking the mind before the wall. The most sophisticated level of siege warfare required no machines at all. Psychological warfare and deception were often more effective than any catapult, and ancient commanders understood that a city's greatest vulnerability was not its walls, but the morale of the people behind them. The threat of what would happen after the walls fell was frequently more powerful than any physical assault. The practice was formalized into a grim protocol. A besieging army would first offer terms of surrender. If the city capitulated immediately, the terms were typically lenient. The population might keep their lives and some property while paying tribute and accepting the conqueror's authority. But if the city resisted, the consequences escalated dramatically. The common practices of sacking, enslavement, and massacre added terrifying credibility to the threats. The Assyrian Empire perfected this approach. Their royal inscriptions deliberately described extreme brutality, flaying victims alive, impaling prisoners on stakes, constructing piles of severed heads outside conquered cities. These accounts were not merely historical records. They were propaganda, intended to reach the next city on the army's path and convince its inhabitants that resistance was futile. The most famous deception in siege warfare history remains the Trojan horse. While its historicity is debated, the story reflected a fundamental truth about ancient siege warfare, that often the only way to gain entry to a well-defended city was through trickery. The ancient historian Herodotus recounted the story of Zopyrus, a Persian soldier so fanatically loyal to King Darius that he mutilated his own face and body, then presented himself to the besieged Babylonians as a deserter who had been punished by the Persian king. Once inside, Zopyrus gradually gained the defenders' trust, eventually opening the city gates to the Persian army. Babylon fell not through force of arms, but through a single man's willingness to destroy his own body in service of deception. Alexander the Great combined both approaches at the siege of Tyre in 332 BC. When the island city refused his diplomatic overtures and then executed his envoys, throwing their bodies into the sea, Alexander spent 7 months constructing a causeway from the mainland to the island, an engineering feat that permanently changed the geography of the eastern Mediterranean. But the physical assault was accompanied by relentless psychological pressure. After finally breaching the walls, Alexander's punishment was deliberately extreme. Approximately 6,000 fighting men were killed within the city, 2,000 Tyrians were crucified along the beach, and some 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The severity was calculated. It sent a message to every other city in his path. Most surrendered without a fight. The mind had been broken before the wall ever was. Level 7. Total Engineering Warfare, Reshaping the Earth Itself. The ultimate level of ancient siege warfare went beyond any single weapon or tactic. It was the application of total engineering power, the ability to literally reshape the landscape, redirect rivers, build artificial mountains, and transform the very geography of a battlefield to make the impossible possible. Only the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world could marshal the resources, manpower, and expertise required for this level of warfare. Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre in 332 BC stands as perhaps the most audacious example. The Phoenician city of Tyre was built on an island approximately half a mile off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, protected by walls that reportedly rose 150 feet above the waterline. The city had a powerful navy, 2 natural harbors, and a history of withstanding prolonged sieges. The Babylonians had besieged the island for 13 years without success. Alexander had no significant fleet. His army was a land force. The island should have been impregnable. But Alexander refused to accept the limitations of geography. He ordered his engineers and soldiers to construct a massive causeway, a mole, from the mainland to the island, using rubble from the abandoned mainland settlement of Old Tyre. Cedars from the famous Lebanese forest were cut to serve as pilings, driven into the seabed like massive stakes. Stone and earth were packed between them. For months, thousands of workers labored under constant missile fire from the city walls and harassment from Tyrian warships. When the Tyrians launched a fireship that destroyed his initial siege towers, Alexander ordered the causeway widened and more towers built. When Tyrian ships attacked the workers, Alexander gathered a fleet from allied Phoenician cities and the kings of Cyprus, assembling over 200 vessels. He then tested the walls at various points with battering rams mounted on ships. When the rams finally created a small breach in the southern wall, Alexander coordinated a simultaneous assault from all directions. Infantry through the breach, ships attacking the harbors, archers and catapults providing covering fire from every angle. He reportedly fought from the top of a siege tower himself. Tyre fell in July 332 BC after 7 months of siege. The causeway Alexander built still exists today. Over the centuries, natural sedimentation around it has transformed the island of Tyre into a peninsula permanently connected to the mainland. Alexander literally reshaped the coastline of the Mediterranean. The Romans demonstrated the same capability at Masada in 73 AD. The fortress stood atop a mesa rising 400 meters above the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. Its single-access path was too narrow for men to walk abreast. Herod the Great had fortified it with thick walls, massive cisterns, and storerooms containing years of provisions. Approximately 960 Jewish rebels held the fortress against the Roman 10th Legion under Governor Flavius Silva. The Romans first constructed a circumvallation wall, stretching over 11 kilometers around the base of the mesa, anchored by 8 fortified camps. Escape was impossible. Then Silva ordered the construction of a siege ramp against the western face of the plateau. His engineers and their forced laborers moved an estimated 500,000 tons of earth and stone, building a ramp approximately 600 meters long that rose 60 meters to the fortress walls. A massive siege tower with a battering ram was then pushed up the completed ramp. When the Romans breached the walls on April 16, 73 AD, they found that the defenders had chosen death over capture. The earth itself would be moved to achieve victory.